Thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to discuss the repair and restoration of my Sansui CA-2000 preamplifier, as well as later in the video team it up with my Sansui TU-717 tuner and my Sansui BA-5000 power amplifier. I hope you enjoy it. If you enjoy vintage audio equipment, you've come to the right spot. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell, as well as giving me a big thumbs up if you like this video and share it with others. There is a risk of serious injury or death from electrical shock working on this equipment. If you're not comfortable with working on the equipment, please do not take the cover off and consult a professional. After 40 plus years of service, the Sansui CA-2000 needs some updating, and that updating will include replacing all of the electrolytic and bipolar capacitors in the unit. This preamplifier was built in the late 70s, from 1977 to 1979. It was a fine preamp in its day, and it can still hold its own when it's working properly. First thing I did was to remove the cover, as you should on any piece of unknown equipment, just to take a look, just to make sure there's not something you could see that's going to cause a problem when you power it up. And that includes the top cover and the bottom cover. And the nice thing about so many preamplifiers, they have no ventilation openings in them. And this one doesn't, so it stayed pristine inside. No dust whatsoever. So that's a nice thing. Usually they're caked with dirt. So what I did first was power it up on the test bench, just do a quick test. I powered it up with a Variac because I wasn't sure if the thing had been powered up in the last 10, 20 years. I didn't know. I received this preamplifier from a high-end stereo dealer here in town who bought it off someone who just brought it in, and he has no interest in it, but he didn't know nothing about it either. So I set it up with a CD player, a pair of headphones, and just did a basic test to see what was working and what wasn't. And it was nice to know that just doing a quick test, everything's, I had a left and right channel, and we had the normal, what do you have, that normal pots and switches being corroded and needing some deox treatment, but that's expected. So the first thing I'm going to do is replace those 40 plus year old electrolytic capacitors in the power supply. One nice thing too about this unit, and a lot of preamplifiers, is they're a little bit simpler and easier to get to. They're not so packed with stuff. So there was a lot of room in this unit, and a lot of preamplifiers, that's the way it is. I'll also, I've removed the knobs from the unit because I want to remove the faceplate to clean that up. The knobs and that type of thing will usually clean up really well with just some warm water, some dish soap. A toothbrush works great. Get an old toothbrush and you can scrub the dirt right off most of them. So I took the faceplate off, and the dirt was able to find its way in there. Even though it wasn't in the chassis, but when I took the faceplate off, there's a pretty good amount of crud. I'll get that cleaned up. The Equalizer Assembly I'm going to rebuild. It's very easy to access too, and you'll notice this unit has plug-in connectors. It's not hardwired to pins, so that made it quite easy. And the Equalizer Assembly is is really the Phono Assembly. I'm going to go ahead and change out the electrolytic capacitors, the bipolar capacitors, and I'm also going to change out the small signal transistors on this assembly. With the Equalizer assembly removed, I could remove the top of the chassis and get the remaining assemblies from the front panel. And I could get the front panel right off. That's what I did. And again, in this unit, it's pretty easy to do. You probably wouldn't be able to do this in a big vintage receiver or amplifier, but in this I was able to do. And now I've got the assemblies in a spot where I can work on them all. They're almost staring right at me here in a pile sitting here on the table, so that's nice. But always, before you start unhooking stuff, take a lot of pictures. Think you know how it goes until you don't. And if you don't have a lot of experience with this stuff, just take pictures so when you go to plug those connectors back in, you orientate them correctly and you put them where they're supposed to be. I've now removed the F2573 filter assembly. Transistors along with the old capacitors, they're going. Like I said, the nice thing about this unit is it's all plug-in, you know, all plug-in stuff, plug-in connectors. So, boy, it's really nice just having that sitting out on the table in front of you. Makes it so much easier than having it pulled on its side, or some of the cables are hanging one way or another and you're worried about breaking them. So it's nice just to be able to get an assembly right out on the table in front of you. And the headphone assembly, the F2491, was the same way. Get in there and get rid of those old electrolytic capacitors. Again, it comes right out in your hand, so it couldn't be any easier. And after 45 years, more than due to get the electrolytic capacitors changed out. I've got the power supply rebuilt. Most likely this is going to be able to run for another few decades anyway. Certainly these electrolytic capacitors were at the end of their life. I've rebuilt the Phono Assembly. You'll see some of the green capacitors in there. Those are bipolar, or what they called back in the day non-polar. You see in this picture here, here's the same. This is how I talk in my videos about the same manufacturers made these capacitors, 40 years ago. So same difference, bipolar, non-polar. Somewhere along the line, they changed the name, but it means the same thing. They will start deteriorating after 15 to 20 years. And again, I want to say they don't all blow up. They don't all bulge. They don't all leak. Most capacitors you cannot tell by looking at them whether they meet spec or not, other than that the manufacturer is telling you after 15 or 20 years, replace them. The VD1212 diodes will be replaced. Again, diodes don't generally have a history of failing, but these diodes do. They were in a lot of vintage stereo equipment from this era, and when you see a VD1212 diode, they must be replaced. They're all going to fail, kind of deal. Almost like an electrolytic capacitor. If yours haven't, they're going to. Again, while you got these assemblies out, it's a great time to look at the other side of the artwork. Take a look at the artwork side. Take a look at those solder joints. You see anything that looks, questionable. And this does happen over years. They heat up, they cool down, and some of these joints can start cracking. Now, in this unit, I didn't really see anything, but it's always a good idea to take a minute to take a look. Of course, you're going to clean those RCA jacks and switches. A lot of people forget about those, but on the F2569 input and switch assembly, again, I've got it right in my hand, which makes it nice to get that all cleaned up. I've got everything changed out. I've got all the components changed out. I've got the chassis cleaned up, and I'm going to start to reassemble it, and hopefully this CA-2000 will go for a few more decades. When you reinstall them, you've probably had to cut some tie wraps. Just wire it back. They have little channels many times like this unit does, and any tie wraps you had to cut, just put a new tie wrap in. Just make it look like it did before you started working on it. So I've got it back together. She, tested out good on the bench. Again, I hooked her up there real quick with just a CD player and headphones, made sure that my work looked good. Now it's time for some music. So the CA-2000 preamplifier repair and restoration is complete. All right. Well, I'm going to go over some of the inputs on the CA-2000. It has two outputs, two preamp outs in the back, if you want to use that. It's got quite an extensive set of tone controls with various turnovers. If you like to use the tone controls, there's plenty of options here. There's also a defeat switch if you don't want to use either tone or filter controls. There's also a filter only and tone and filter. So you can do any combination you want. Your standard filters here, high and low filter. A little bit unusual, I guess, maybe with the low filter, it's got two choices. It's got 20 hertz or 60 hertz. So that's a little bit different maybe. And two of the high filter too. I think, 7 kilohertz and 12 kilohertz, but you probably won't use those much. The muting switch, you know, gives you a little bit more range on your volume if you want to. If the phone rings or whatever, you can run up and hit that real quick. You know, you got your balance control, standard balance. It's got again, a lot of the stereo equipment back in the 70s had this mode selector where you could, you know, be in stereo, you could be in reverse, I guess if you mixed your speakers up. I'm not exactly sure. You had left and right, you had left and then right by itself. I never used those very much. I don't think many people do. Most people are going to just leave it in normal and be done with it. Two tape inputs, which is nice, right? Tape 1, tape 2, and then a copy button down here. It's got two phono inputs, which again is nice, and two auxes. So that's very nice too. And the tuner, a little bit unusual, right, on the Sansui. You know, it's got like a separate switch for tuner. And one note to make on Phono 1, 3 different load inputs for your phono cartridge, and also 3 different sensitivity settings for your phono cartridge. So you can set that up to match up what you've got, but it's really a full-featured amplifier, and I'd put it up with any of them. I mean, it is a great sounding unit, and I have to tell you, I guess mixed in here with my my Sansui TU-17, which I've had since I bought it new when I was 17 years old. Maybe I'm a little bit partial here. I'm thinking, well, it's got to be sounding great, right? I've had it for a long time. So, and you can't forget the BA-5000 down here. All you can say is what a brute, you know. Not a speaker, this thing cannot drive. Just make sure you got 20 amp service when you're doing it, because she's power hungry little devil. Well, what can you say? I mean, it's just a tremendous performer. This CA-2000, if you ever get one and it's been updated, meaning that any signal transistors that needed to be changed are changed out, and of course those electrolytic capacitors that I hate, it'll hold its own against any vintage preamplifier and will not embarrass you in any modern system. So many times you'll see the vintage stuff get knocked, and almost always the thing's never been worked on. They're 40, 50 years old, and people are saying they stink and they sound terrible. Well, get some fresh electrolytic and bipolar capacitors into a CA-2000 and then say that. I don't think you will. I hope that you enjoyed my Sansui CA-2000 preamplifier repair and restoration. If you did, I'd appreciate a big thumbs up down below. For you non-subscribers, if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please subscribe. And to my present subscribers, thank you so much. You all have a good day.